Hello, I'm Sophie Zhang. I'm a Facebook whistleblower. I worked at Facebook from January 2018 through September 2020. And in that time, I conducted a lot of work in countries, especially in the global south, including Honduras, Azerbaijan, and others, in which I found the government conducting coordinated inauthentic behavior in very large scales, pretending to be their own citizens in order to mislead and repress their fellow citizens. I also conducted significant work in India. My general experience has been that this sort of activity is very sadly much more normalized in the global south. In India, I found 5 networks of fake accounts across the political spectrum, and Facebook agreed to take these down much quicker than the ones in Honduras and Azerbaijan, because India is a large country and deeply important to Facebook. However, even though Facebook had already agreed to take them down, they changed their mind on one of them once we discovered that network of fake accounts was directly linked to the personal account of the sitting chairperson of the Indian Parliamentary Committee on Ethics. As soon as the discovery was made, I could not get an answer from anyone. It was as if they had stonewalled me. I asked repeatedly over the next several months. I asked repeatedly, even when we were working on separate networks in order to protect ongoing elections in Delhi, the Indian capital region. I could not get a response or even acknowledgement. I've been told anecdotally by other Facebook employees, current and former, that Facebook faces the most political interference in India of all countries. That the company is it's most deferential to government politicians and lobbying in India, both because of the country's importance and also the increased willingness of the country to threaten action against Facebook, and the lack of public reaction that would support a tougher line in India. I discovered a sitting parliamentary member from the ruling party who chaired the Parliamentary Committee on Ethics red-handed, and Facebook refused to act. In contrast, when I found the equivalent of state legislators from the opposing party who were involved, Facebook acted very quickly. Shivnath Sukro, who was previously the Facebook head of policy in India, personally approved the takedown in about 8 hours. Right. I can't read minds, but Facebook has a strong incentive to be solicitous and deferential towards the ruling party. I don't think I don't think they have a specific political bias except for favoring those in power. If the opposition won in India, I don't think Facebook would be any different. But it also creates a difficult dynamic because if Facebook is being biased towards those in power, that means that those in government have an advantage. And the people who have the ability to regulate Facebook and force it to change the situation have no incentive to change that situation. And the only people who want to change the situation are those not in power, who have no ability to change it. And even if an opposing government is elected, that government, no matter their platform, may change their mind once Facebook becomes much more favorable towards them. It makes it very difficult to solve the actual problem. When I came forward as a whistleblower, I thought that it was very important for me to offer my testimony and documentation to world governments. I publicly announced that I would be happy to testify and offer for documentation regarding the nation, if applicable, to any democratic nation. In my experience, government works either extremely slowly or extremely quickly. When I testified to the British Parliament, it was extremely quick. I mean, Damian Collins, the conservative representative from Folkestone Heights, sent me a message, and 6 days later, I was testifying remotely to the British Parliament. They set up the testimony, the organization, the session, etc., extremely quickly because they were interested in hearing what I had to say. When I tested to the European Parliament almost 2 years ago now, they had a session about a month away that they invited me to, but they were interested in my testimony, and things went very smoothly. This was not the case for India. I repeatedly offered my testimony to the Indian Parliament because I believed it was my civic duty as someone who cared about democracy and the rule of law. The Indian Parliamentary Committee on Information Technology eventually voted unanimously to invite my testimony, which I do want to give them strong credit for, because I mean the documents I had offered them implicated members of both the opposition party and the ruling party, and still those party members voted unanimously to invite me. With that said, the speaker is required to approve or deny my testimony because I'm a foreign national, and that is required in India. And so once Parliament voted unanimously to invite me, the common wisdom was that the speaker's approval would be an afterthought because it would have looked very bad to refuse, and obviously he would accept. Instead, I seem to have inadvertently led to the invention of a pocket veto by the speaker, which is certainly an inconsequence, but not the one I expected to have on India. So it's been 7 months actually, since Parliament voted unanimously. It's actually 8 months, sorry, I cannot count. It's been 8 months since the committee voted unanimously to invite me. The speaker still has not responded. He seems intent on waiting out the end of existence, and I was sufficiently fed up that I considered him to have refused my testimony, and to have exhausted my responsibility to the Indian Parliament, and therefore I released all the documentation in question with a group of Indian news outlets a month or so ago. You might be wondering what Facebook said in response to this. Well, a week after I released the documents, the official response was that they had not been provided the documents and therefore could not comment on them, even though I had released them publicly to everyone in the world. I think ultimately it's important for Facebook to remember that it's an American company. They may be focused on their own profit, but at the end of the day, even a first-class seat on the Titanic is still a seat on the Titanic. If Facebook leads to the degradation of democracy in India, that will hurt its relationships with the United States. That will hurt American interests globally. And India is an important prospective U.S. ally against the PRC, and cultivating that alliance is important to U.S. foreign policy. Facebook has effectively conducted a massive donation in kind to authoritarian governments by refusing to act and allowing their bad behavior to continue. Because even now, 3 years after I got the Azari government red-handed, Facebook took some small action, but allowed them to come back immediately afterwards. They are still active. They are still harassing the Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, Azerbaijan. When the Facebook pages of those outlets make posts, they are deluged by hundreds, thousands of comments claiming that Azerbaijan does not need Western democracy and the government is great, all of which are made not by actual Azaris, but by government paid or associated trolls associated with the ruling party. And frankly, I think it's a bit disloyal for Facebook to allow this to continue. The root of the problem is simply that Facebook is a company It cares not about saving the world and protecting democracy. It cares about its own profit. That things happen on Facebook. They cause media attention, which cause people to care, which might affect Facebook's bottom line. And this might work for other areas, but it is unique, but it is not really successful for the area of inauthentic activity of fake accounts. Because the point of a fake account is to not be seen. And the better you are at not being seen, the fewer people will see you. In Facebook right now, an economist would call this a combination of an externality problem and an information asymmetry. In layperson's terms, the costs of this bad behavior isn't borne by Facebook itself, it's borne by society. But society does not know about this, only Facebook does. You can't solve a problem until you understand it and you know it exists in the first place. And so when I testified to the British Parliament, when I testified to the European Parliament, my core suggestions were at fixing this information asymmetry by, for instance, requiring Facebook to give certain internal data access to researchers to independently vet its results. By, for instance, and I realize this will be more politically difficult, setting up red team style penetration test exercises, so that, for instance, the FBI or someone appropriate could have its trusted employees set up networks of fake accounts in very controlled circumstances. So as a test, being very careful to make sure they don't actually affect anything, so that afterwards they can do an analysis and report and say, we set up 10 each on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit. Facebook took down 1, Twitter took down 0, Reddit took down 0. They're all awful. Facebook is the least awful. These are made up numbers, of course. Because right now, we don't know these numbers. We don't know if Facebook is better, Twitter is better, etc. We know what they've called, but it doesn't tell us anything about what they haven't called. In the same way that, and I don't know how feasible it would be, but I think it might also be of consequence to have some sort of regulation about Facebook enforcing its terms of services evenly. Because right now, Facebook gives special leeway to those in power, and that includes enemies to U.S. interests. It includes those who have no incentive to change Facebook's activity in their country. I mean, Azerbaijan is happy to have the Azeri government is happy to have Azerbaijan as their own playground, in the same way that Russia is trying to carve out its own internet, or the PRC for that matter. That's because and right now there's nothing to stop Facebook from letting that happen.